The obsidian rotunda of the High Synod did not merely house the governing bodies of the Galaxian hegemony. It was designed to crush them under the weight of history. The chamber was a colossal sphere of polished volcanic glass, suspended within the gravimetric heart of a hollowed-out moon, lit only by the dying crimson bioluminescence of the hanging moss gardens and the harsh, sterile white of the central data pylons. Here, the air was always cold, recycled through filtration systems that had been scrubbing the same oxygen for 10,000 cycles, tasting of ozone, ancient dust, and the metallic tang of fear. High Counselor Vogt, a venerable elder of the Ethelgard, adjusted the ceremonial robes that draped over his slender, multi-jointed frame, his compound eyes twitching as they scanned the holographic projections floating above the obsidian table. The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, pressurized, filled with the unspoken terrors of 100 species who had convinced themselves that they were the masters of the stars, only to find a shadow growing on the periphery of their maps that defied every algorithm in the great calculus. Vogt's manipulator claw hovered over the console, trembling slightly, a weakness he hoped the Krell representative, Warlord Throx, would not notice. But Throx noticed everything. The massive chitin-plated warrior was shifting in his containment field, the guttural growl of his breathing apparatus echoing like distant thunder in the acoustic perfection of the rotunda. Throx wanted war. The Krell always wanted war. It was the only language their genetic code had not forgotten. Vogt was a creature of logic, of history, and of the sacred texts that governed the Ethelgardian philosophy of expansion. And those texts were currently screaming a warning that the Council seemed determined to ignore. The projection in the center of the room displayed a sector of space that had once been labeled uninhabitable void on the star charts of the previous dynasty. Now, it was a burning bruise of signal traffic, distorted energy readings, and the debris of the Third Expeditionary Fleet. The decision must be made, Vogt, Throx rumbled, his voice synthesized into the trade tongue by the collar around his thick neck. The Terran anomaly is not retreating. They have burned the probe ships. They have silenced the beacons. They are a pestilence that does not respect the boundaries of the hegemony. Every moment we waste in this tomb of debate is a moment they use to sharpen their blades. We must strike the nest. We must burn their worlds before they understand the mechanics of our star drives. Vogt looked up, his mandibles clicking softly in a gesture of irritation that he quickly suppressed. And if the blade you strike with shatters against their skin, Throx, what then? We have analyzed the wreckage of the Third Fleet. There were no weapon signatures, no plasma burns, no kinetic impact craters. The ships were dismantled, disassembled at the molecular level. We are not dealing with a rival empire that fights for resources. We are dealing with an entity that understands physics in a way the great calculus cannot predict. To provoke them further, without understanding the nature of the entity we face, is not war. It is suicide. A ripple of murmurs went through the assembled delegates. The Xyloth hive mind representative, a towering construct of silver metal and biological sludge, emitted a burst of binary static that translated as agreement. The Xyloth feared the unpredictable above all else, and the humans, this species that had emerged from the silence of the Orion Arm, were the definition of chaos. They did not broadcast on standard frequencies. They did not respond to the diplomatic hails in the manner of a civilized species. They simply existed, expanding slowly, silently, their ships' dark shapes against the stars that absorbed sensor pings rather than reflecting them. Fear is a poison, Throx spat, slamming a fist onto the obsidian surface, causing the holographic map to flicker. You speak of them as if they are gods. They are biologicals, soft, short-lived. We have seen their physiology from the corpses recovered in the border zone. They are fragile, they bleed, they require oxygen. They are nothing new. You Vogt, you cling to the old superstitions. You speak of the lost truth as if it matters. The only truth is power. And we have the combined might of 12,000 star systems. They have, what? One sector, a few rocky worlds. We outnumber them 1,000,000 to 1. Vogt closed his eyes, the memory of the ancient data core he had unearthed in the deepest archives of the Ethelgard homeworld surfacing in his mind. It was a fragmented warning, a corrupted file from a civilization that had been dust long before the hegemony had learned to forge iron. It was a warning that had haunted his sleep for cycles. They cried out to the galaxy. The fragment had read, "Do not provoke the humans," but the rest of the file was gone. Why? Why had a precursor civilization feared these soft, fragile creatures? What was the context? The hegemony had assumed the humans were a young species, new to the galactic stage. But the artifacts Vogt had studied suggested something else. Something older. Something that implied the humans were not new, but returning. "It is not their numbers that concern me, warlord," Vogt said softly, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics so that it reached the highest tiers of the gallery where the minor species watched in terrified silence. "It is their silence. A species that screams threats is a species that fears you. A species that postures and displays its weapons is a species that seeks to avoid conflict through intimidation. But the humans, they have said nothing. They destroyed the Third Fleet in 20 minutes and they did not broadcast a victory cry. They did not issue demands. They simply continued. That is not the behavior of a conqueror. That is the behavior of an exterminator clearing a nest of vermin. And I fear, counselors, that we are the vermin." The harsh light of the data pylon seemed to cold, casting long, jagged shadows across the faces of the delegates. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of fear pheromones. The debate had been raging for 3 solar cycles. The Hawks wanted a preemptive strike, a total sanitation of the human sector. The Doves, led by Vogt, wanted to send a high diplomat to try one last time to breach the wall of silence. But time was running out. The sensors on the perimeter were detecting a massive energy buildup in the human sector. Not an invasion fleet, but something else. A gravitational distortion so immense it was warping the light of the stars around it. "The vote is called," the automated voice of the Citadel AI announced, devoid of emotion. "Motion 74 Alpha, immediate mobilization of the Grand Armada for a strike against the Terran systems. All delegates cast your tokens." Vogt watched in despair as the lights on the voting board turned crimson one by one. The Krell voted for war. The aquatic reptilians of the Hylo voted for war. Even the trade guilds, terrified of losing their shipping lanes, voted for war. Logic had failed. Fear had won. The hegemony would march into the dark, screaming its defiance, and Vogt felt a cold certainty in his heart that they would not return. "The motion carries," the AI stated. "The Armada will launch in 6 standard hours. May the progenitors watch over us." Thrax let out a roar of triumph, his mandibles flared wide. "Finally, we shall bring their heads to the rotunda. We shall see if they are so silent when their worlds burn." But the roar was cut short. The entire Citadel shuddered. It was not the vibration of an engine or the impact of a weapon. It was a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in the fluid of their inner ears, a sound that bypassed the senses and struck directly at the soul. The lights in the rotunda flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness, save for the emergency strobes that pulsed a sickly yellow. The holographic map in the center of the room dissolved, replaced by a static wash of white noise. "Report," Vogt screamed, his voice cracking. "Status report, are we under attack?" "Sensors are blind," a technician shouted from the pit below the council tiers. "Massive gravitational wave detected directly off the port bow. It materialized inside the defense grid. It bypassed the shields entirely." "Impossible," Thrax growled, drawing his kinetic pistol. "Nothing bypasses the grid, nothing." The static on the central display cleared, coalescing into an image that froze the blood of every being in the room. Hanging in the void outside the Citadel, dwarfing the massive station, was a structure of impossible geometry. It was not a ship. It was a monolith of matte black material that absorbed the starlight, a jagged tear in the fabric of reality. It had no engines, no windows, no weapon ports. It was simply a towering slab of darkness, miles high, silent and imposing. And standing on the hull of the Citadel, docked via a breaching tube that had cut through the station's meter-thick armor like a hot knife through wax, was a small, sleek shuttle. "They are here," the technician whispered. "They are boarding." The massive blast doors of the rotunda, reinforced with tritanium and energy fields, began to groan. Metal screamed as it was bent by unseen forces. There were no explosions, no plasma cutters. The doors simply folded. They crumpled inward as if gripped by a giant, invisible hand, the metal shrieking in protest before being torn from the hinges and tossed aside like parchment. Thrax leveled his weapon at the smoke-filled breach. "Fire, kill anything that moves." A dozen Krell honor guards opened fire, filling the entryway with a storm of plasma bolts and kinetic rounds. The air turned into a superheated haze of ozone and burning metal. The barrage lasted for a full minute, enough firepower to level a city block. When the weapons clicked empty, the smoke slowly drifted away, revealing the corridor beyond. Standing in the center of the devastation, untouched, were 3 figures. They wore no power armor. They carried no visible weapons. They were clad in simple dark gray tunics and trousers, with heavy boots and coats made of a dense, fibrous material. The one in the center was an older male, his hair white and cropped short, his face lined with the weathering of age. He held up a hand, and in front of him the air shimmered with a faint, hexagonal lattice, a personal shield of such density that the plasma bolts had dissipated harmlessly against it. The silence that followed was absolute. The Krell guards stared at their overheating weapons in disbelief. Throx took a step back, his combat instincts warring with the impossibility of what he was seeing. The human male stepped forward, stepping over the twisted wreckage of the blast doors. He did not look like a warrior. He looked like a tired academic. He looked around the vast, terrifying chamber of the alien High Council with an expression of mild curiosity, as if he were visiting a museum. "I am Ambassador Solon," the human said. His voice was not shouted. He did not use a translator device, yet his words were heard clearly in the native language of every species present. It was a psionic broadcast, a telepathic projection of meaning that bypassed the ear and spoke directly to the mind. "We received your declaration of war. We thought it best to come and discuss the misunderstanding before you made a mistake you could not unmake." Vogt felt his knees give way. He collapsed into his seat, his mind reeling. Telepathy? No species in the hegemony possessed such a gift. It was a myth, a power attributed to the gods of old. You invade our sanctuary," Throx snarled, finding his voice, though it lacked its usual bravado. "You destroy our fleet, you mock our borders, and now you speak of misunderstanding. You are monsters." Solon looked at the massive Krell warlord with a gaze that was disturbingly calm. It was not the look of a predator assessing prey. It was the look of a parent watching a tantruming child. "Did not destroy your fleet, General," Solon said, walking slowly toward the central table. The guards did not shoot. They were paralyzed by an overwhelming aura of heaviness emanating from the humans, a psychic pressure that made violence seem difficult, like moving through molasses. "Your fleet entered a quarantine zone, a zone marked by beacons that have stood for 50,000 years. Your ships breached the containment of a Type 4 hazard. The automated systems sterilized them to prevent infection. We did not fire a single shot. The protocols are automatic. We were distressed to learn of the loss of life. We assumed the beacons were sufficient warning. We forgot that younger races often mistake warnings for challenges." "Younger," the Xyloth representative buzzed. "The hegemony has stood for 10,000 cycles. We are the elders of the galaxy." Solon smiled, a sad, weary expression. 10,000 cycles," he repeated. "A blink, a breath. The beacons were placed there when your ancestors were still crawling out of the primordial oceans." He reached the obsidian table. He placed a small device, no larger than a pebble, onto the surface. "You believe us to be conquerors," Solon continued, his voice echoing in their minds, resonant with a profound sorrow. "You believe we are hiding in the dark because we are plotting to take your worlds. You look at our silence and you see a threat. You do not ask why we are silent. You do not ask what we are listening for." Vogt found the strength to stand. He felt a strange kinship with this human, a resonance of shared burden. "What are you listening for, Ambassador?" Solon turned to Vogt, acknowledging him for the first time. "We are listening for the breaking of the chain, and I am afraid, High Counselor, that your great calculus has missed the variable that matters most. You are preparing to go to war with us. You are gathering your armadas. You are stripping your worlds of defenses to strike at the Terran sector." Solon tapped the pebble. The air above the table exploded into light. It was not the grainy, flickering hologram of the Ethelgard technology. It was a perfect, high-fidelity simulation of the galaxy. It swirled and rotated, a majestic spiral of light. But then, the view zoomed out. It pulled back further and further until the galaxy was just a small island of light in a vast, encroaching ocean of darkness. And in that darkness, something was moving. Shapes, billions of them, massive tendril-like structures that dwarfed star systems. They were surrounding the galaxy, tightening like a noose. A silent, encroaching tide of void stuff that was eating the stars on the rim. "This," Solon said, pointing to the encroaching darkness, "is the silent tide. It is an extragalactic swarm that consumes energy. It eats stars, it eats civilizations, it eats light. It has consumed 3 galaxies in the local cluster already." The room was frozen in horror. The scale of the threat was beyond comprehension. "We," Solon said, gesturing to himself and his 2 silent companions, "are not the conquerors of this galaxy. We are the custodians. For the last 20,000 years, humanity has been fighting a war on the rim in the dark where you cannot see. We have built walls of Dyson spheres and shield worlds to hold them back. We have sacrificed billions of our own kind to keep the tide from washing over your civilized space. We stay silent because we are busy. We do not trade because we have nothing to sell you but death. We do not expand because every resource we have is poured into the wall. Throx sank into his chair, his weapon clattering to the floor. A lie, he whispered, but there was no conviction in it. The data on the screen was too detailed, too consistent with the anomalies the Krell navigators had reported but ignored. It is no lie, Solon said softly. And the tragedy, counselors, is that by attacking our perimeter, by destroying the patrol drones you called the Third Fleet, you have created a breach. You disrupted the synchronization of the shield wall in Sector 9. You thought you were poking a sleeping beast. In reality, you were punching a hole in the hull of the submarine that keeps the ocean from crushing you. The heavy silence that followed was suffocating. The sheer magnitude of the mistake was crushing. The hegemony had spent decades politicking, debating, and posturing, while the humans, these primitive upstarts, had been holding up the sky. Why, Vogt whispered, tears leaking from his compound eyes. Why did you not tell us? Why did you not ask for help? We have fleets, we have resources, we could have fought together. Solon looked at the gathered aliens with a mixture of pity and steel. Because, counselor, the last time we asked for help, the civilizations of this galaxy panicked. They tried to flee, they broke the quarantine, they tried to bargain with the tide, it didn't work. Chaos aids the enemy. Logic dictates that a terrified population is a liability. We decided it was safer to protect you without your knowledge than to risk your panic destroying the defense grid. We underestimated your curiosity. And your arrogance? The human leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. The atmosphere in the room shifted from fear to a strange, deferential awe. The humans were not just powerful, they were ancient. They were the adults in the room, and the hegemony were children playing with matches in a powder keg. But that is in the past, Solon said, his voice hardening. The breach is open. The tide has noticed the fluctuation. They are coming through the gap you created. The war you voted for, you will get it, but not against us. The image on the table shifted. It showed a red vector piercing the galaxy's rim, heading straight for the Ethelgard core systems. They will be here in 3 days, Solon stated matter-of-factly. Not a fleet, a harvester tendril. It will strip the atmosphere from your worlds and suck the plasma from your suns. Your armada is useless against it. Your kinetic weapons will simply feed it kinetic energy. Panic began to rise in the chamber, a bubbling, chaotic noise of terrified whispers and shouts. Throx looked at his hands, realizing the futility of his strength. The Xyloth representative began to calculate casualties, the numbers spiraling into the trillions. Is there no hope? Vogt asked, his voice trembling. Have we doomed ourselves? Solon straightened his coat. We did not come here to gloat, counselor. We came to coordinate. We cannot patch the breach in time, but we can divert the flow. We have a strategy. It involves baiting the tendril into a collapsing star system. But we need ships, not to fight, but to generate mass. We need your armada to act as a gravitational lure. It is a suicide mission for the ships involved. They will be automated, of course, but the loss of material will be total. You want us to sacrifice the Grand Armada? Throx asked, disbelief warring with understanding. I want you to save your species, Solon corrected. We have the technology to rig your drives to overload in unison, creating a singularity that will sever the tide's tendril. We will provide the shielding to get the ships into position. But we need the ships, and we need them now. The humans stood there waiting. They were not begging. They were offering a lifeline. The irony was bitter. The Ethelgard had wanted to send the Armada to destroy humanity, and now humanity was asking for the Armada to save the Ethelgard. Vogt looked at the voting board. He looked at Throx. The Krell warlord stood up, his massive frame shaking. He looked at Solon, then at Vogt. The Krell do not fear death, Throx said, his voice low. We fear a death without meaning. To die saving the galaxy, that is a warrior's end. He turned to the console. I revoke my vote for war against Terra. I move to place the Krell battle fleet under the command of the Terran Defense Initiative. I second, the Xyloth chimed instantly. Logic dictates cooperation is the only path to survival. One by one, the lights on the board turned green, not for war, but for alliance, for submission to the greater wisdom of the species they had mocked. Solon nodded a brief, tight movement. Good, transmitting navigation vectors now. We have work to do. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity, unlike anything the Citadel had ever seen. The cultural barriers that had separated the species for millennia dissolved in the face of the existential threat. Terran engineers, beaming down from their massive black monolith ship, worked side by side with Krell mechanics and Xyloth cybersurgeons. The humans moved with a terrifying efficiency. There was no bureaucracy in their actions, no hesitation. They spoke in short, precise commands, their technology interfacing seamlessly with the clumsy, archaic systems of the hegemony. Vogt walked the hangar decks, watching the integration. He saw a human engineer, a young female with cybernetic eyes, stripping the safety limiters off a Krell fusion drive. She was explaining the physics of the modification to a group of awestruck Krell technicians, drawing diagrams in the air with a light pen. They listened to her as if she were a high priestess. He found Ambassador Solon standing on the observation deck, looking out at the gathering armada. The fleet was a magnificent sight, thousands of warships, their hulls gleaming in the starlight. But Vogt knew they were nothing more than moths flying into a bonfire. "It is a heavy thing," Vogt said, joining the human at the viewport. "To realize that everything you knew was a lie. We thought we were the pinnacle of evolution." Solon didn't turn, he kept his eyes on the stars. "Evolution is not a ladder, counselor. It is a filter. You pass the filter of your own atomic age. You pass the filter of planetary unification. But the great filter, the one that stops civilizations from becoming cosmic, that is the tide. We have been holding the door shut for a long time. It gets lonely." "The warning," Vogt said, remembering the text. "They cried out to the galaxy, 'Do not provoke humans.' The ancient civilization that left that record, they knew you." Solon sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "They were the first wardens before us, the Oni. They fought the tide for 100,000 years. They built the first layer of the wall. When they were exhausted, when they could no longer hold the line, they found us. We were young then, primitive, but we had something they lacked: stubbornness, spite, the refusal to accept the inevitable. They uplifted us, gave us their tech, and then they passed the torch. The warning wasn't to protect us from you. It was to protect you from the reality of what we have to be to win this war. We are not a peaceful species, Vogt. We are a species that has channeled all its violence, all its rage into a single, eternal purpose: survival. To provoke us is to distract us, and to distract us is to doom everyone." Vogt shivered. The calm, professorial demeanor of the human was a mask. Underneath, Vogt could sense the terrifying resolve of a species that had been at war for longer than the Ethelgard had written history. "The truth that was lost," Vogt mused, "is that the galaxy is a siege camp." "Yes," Solon said, "and the siege is breaking." The comms unit on Solon's collar chirped. "Ambassador, the lure is in position. The tide has altered trajectory. It is taking the bait." "Execute," Solon ordered. On the massive screens of the observation deck, the scene played out in silence. The grand armada of the hegemony, unmanned and rigged to overload, drifted into the gravity well of the collapsing star system of Sector 9. And from the darkness of the intergalactic void, the horror emerged. It was not a ship. It was a cloud of shadows, a writhing mass of tendrils that blotted out the nebula behind it. It was larger than a solar system. It reached out, hungry, sensing the massive energy signature of the fleet. It ignored the tiny, cloaked Terran ships observing from the distance. It wanted the meal. As the tendrils wrapped around the armada, the trap sprung. Solon tapped a command on his datapad. Thousands of warp cores detonated simultaneously. But they didn't just explode. They had been modified by Terran science to implode. They created a localized tear in space-time, a momentary black hole of impossible density. The scream of the tide was not heard, but it was felt. A psychic backlash of pain and rage that swept across the galaxy, making psychics bleed from their noses and causing sensors to overload. The tendril was severed, sheared off by the gravitational shear. The main body of the tide recoiled, pulling back into the dark, wounded. The flash of light was blinding, even through the filters. Then silence. The armada was gone. The star system was gone. The tendril was dissolving into harmless radiation. "It is done," Solon said, his shoulders slumping slightly. "We have bought another 1,000 years." Vogt stared at the empty space where the pride of his civilization had been. He felt a profound sense of loss, but also of clarity. The petty squabbles over borders, over resources, over trade routes, it all seemed so small now. "What happens now?" Vogt asked. Solon turned to him. Now you grow up. The veil is lifted. You know what is out there. We can no longer fight this alone. We need your industry. We need your soldiers. We need your minds. We will teach you how to build the shields. We will teach you how to fight the dark." but the days of your innocence are over. Welcome to the real galaxy, Counselor. The doors to the observation deck opened, and Throx entered. The Krell warlord looked humbled, his aggression replaced by a solemn respect. He carried a datapad. "The Council is reconvening," Throx said. "They are waiting for the human representative. They want to discuss the terms of the alliance." Solon nodded. "Then let us not keep them waiting." As they walked back toward the rotunda, Vogt looked at the human. He realized that the title of the ancient warning had been misinterpreted. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Do not provoke humans, because if you do, you force them to stop saving you and start dealing with you. And the galaxy could not afford for the humans to look away from the wall. The truth was indeed lost no longer. The galaxy was not a garden to be conquered. It was a fortress to be defended. And as Vogt walked beside the ambassador, he realized that for the first time in history, the Ethelgard were not the masters of their fate. They were the squires to a knight who had been fighting in the rain for an eternity, waiting for someone to bring them a fresh sword. They entered the rotunda. The lighting was different now, warmer, less severe. The fear was gone, replaced by a grim determination. The aliens stood as Solon entered. They did not bow, for that was not the way of the council, but they lowered their manipulators, their tentacles, their antennae. It was a gesture of acknowledgement. Solon took his place at the center of the room. He did not lecture. He did not boast. He simply activated the map of the galaxy, highlighting the defensive perimeters, the weak points, the logistical chains needed. "We begin with the Perseus arm," Solon said, his voice steady. "We will need to strip mine the uninhabited systems for Dyson swarm materials. The Krell will coordinate the fabrication. The Ethelgard will manage the logistics algorithm. Your great calculus will finally have a variable worth computing." Vogt sat at his console, his fingers flying across the interface. He was working faster than he ever had in his life. There was a purpose now. The terror of the tide was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it was matched by a new feeling: hope. Because they were not alone. The monsters they had feared were actually the angels at the gate, covered in the blood of the enemy, asking for ammunition. And as the council session extended into the night, forging the first treaties of the Galactic Defense Pact, Vogt looked at the ancient data fragment one last time before deleting it. The warning was no longer needed. They had provoked the humans, yes, but in doing so, they had woken themselves up. The galaxy had cried out, and the humans had answered not with fire but with the shield. The long night was coming, but for the first time, the galaxy was ready to light the torches. Vogt looked at Solon, who was patiently explaining the physics of a zero-point energy extractor to the Hylo delegate. The human looked tired, infinitely tired. "We will help you carry the weight," Vogt thought, projecting the thought as loud as he could, hoping the telepath could hear him. Solon paused mid-sentence. He looked up across the crowded room and met Vogt's eyes. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He gave a barely perceptible nod. "Thank you," the voice echoed in Vogt's mind. "About time." The work continued. The silence of the void was deep, but the silence of the council was broken by the hum of unity. The truth was terrible, but it was theirs. And they would face it, standing behind the humans, crying out to the galaxy no longer in fear, but in defiance. The narrative arc had closed, but the history of the new galaxy was just beginning. The Ethelgard would no longer be the bureaucrats of a stagnant empire. They would be the quartermasters of the war for survival. The Krell would no longer be mindless conquerors. They would be the guardians of the flank. And the humans would no longer be the ghosts in the machine. They would be the leaders they had always been, emerging from the shadows not to conquer, but to save. And deep in the void, the tide recoiled, sensing something it had not encountered in eons. It sensed resistance. It sensed a united front. It sensed that the prey had grown teeth. The provocation was over. The war had begun, and the humans were smiling.